Tonight, Sleepy Histories drifts along the northern frontier in the reign of King David I, where a learned envoy rests within a newly raised stone stronghold, earthen Motte beneath, curtain wall encircling, austere hall above, while wind sighs past shuttered arrow-slits, and calm settles like a cloak. If this gentle journey soothes the mind, a quiet like and subscribe would be welcome. The northern frontier under King David I lay quiet beneath a vast sky, and a new stone stronghold on its earthen mound watched the flats and reed beds with steady, unfamiliar angles. The traveller reached it by a causeway skirting sodden ground, where waterfowl lifted and settled without alarm, and the grass came up clean against the newly faced curtain wall. A timber hall had once stood here, and the locals still spoke of old palisades and brushwood ramparts, but squared blocks now took the weather, and small arrow-slits blinked like calm eyes over the fields. As Geoffrey Stell has noted in studies of Scottish fortifications, such masonry announced not only defense but change, for earth and timber gave way to coursed stone in a measured spread of techniques and habits. W. Douglas Simpson placed these northern halls in a story of austerity and purpose, their chambers narrow and cool, their upper rooms designed for watchfulness rather than show. Under those principles, the fortress looked inland and seaward at once, with its motte lifted above a broad bailey, and its gate guarded by a simple yet deliberate arrangement of towers and timbered walkways. The traveller dismounted in a court that smelled of wet straw and peat smoke, and the steward's men, in quilted jacks and patched cloaks, led the horse to a lean-to by the wall, while the envoy passed under a pointed arch and into the upper chamber where work and warmth would mingle. Administrative change travelled north on parchment and seal, and the envoy's satchel carried both. In the upper hall, a hearth glowed with a low, steady fire, and a trestle table held a scripter's knives, a horn of ink, and a wax tablet smoothed for the next hand. Richard Oram has described how David's reign knit the kingdom with charters, burg foundations, and reformed lordships, and the textiles of that knitting could be felt even here. A steward's formula of Latin phrases, a witness list with knights' names in French, a Gaelic place name carefully Latinized. The envoy laid out letters confirming rights of pasture and mill, privileges for a small market to be kept on certain days, and obligations of service measured in weeks of mounted duty, all modest in appearance yet weighty in consequence. New burghs had been planted at river crossings and tidal havens during and after this reign, and traders followed the legal shelter they offered, bringing salt, iron fittings, and fine cloth to places where, not long ago, cattle and cured fish had passed without reckoning in a merchant's book. Such instruments did not erase the speech and memory of the countryside, but they drew them into a wider script, just as the masonry outside drew an older earthwork into a newer geometry. Bread arrived at the table, well baked and warm, along with ale the colour of amber in the firelight, and the clerk and the steward spoke softly about boundaries marked by streams, oaks, and standing stones, now to be named in writing for the first time. Church matters threaded through the evening business with a steady, patient rhythm, as had become common in this reign. A chaplain entered from the stair, his cloak damp at the hem, and unfolded a small bundle of documents that concerned tithes to support a parish newly defined on the edge of the Lord's lands. The bishopric that watched over this region had moved more than once in earlier generations, and reforming currents continued to shape its seat and its network of clergy, bringing canons, new customs, and a tidier ordering of dues and rights. Oram has emphasized how closely the king's patronage of monasteries and churches worked with secular administration, and the evidence rested plainly on the table. Land granted to a house of canons, a clause safeguarding the poor's share of the fishery, a confirmation of sanctuary. The chaplain spoke Latin in the formulas and Gaelic in the explanations, while the steward answered in French-cut phrases softened by the north, and the envoy took note of each cadence, for the kingdom's fabric relied as much on speech as on seal. When the wind rose outside, boards were drawn over the arrow-slits, and the room settled into a dim, even light, smoke lifting in a slow ribbon toward the rafters. The traveler accepted another slice of bread with a nod, the crust cracking gently as conversation thinned to murmurs and the scratch of a pen. Architecture and routine framed the night with equal restraint, each lending the other a sense of order that reached beyond the walls. Simpson's descriptions of austere upper halls, bare of ornament and built for endurance, came to life here. Benches along the stone, a curtained bed near the hearth, a chest with iron straps, and shields hung neatly where the light would not fade their paint. Outside, the curtain wall enclosed a bailey where timber ranges housed stores and grooms, and beyond that, the ground fell to wet meadows that had once fed a loch, now half-drained and ringed with rushes. Stell's account of Motte and bailey forms evolving into stonework felt apt in every angle. This mound raised by hands long accustomed to earth, now capped by courses of pale stone, and a hall that resisted both storm and ember. The lineage overseeing this place traced to settlers from the Low Countries who had received lands after a rising in Moray was subdued, and their service bound them to the crown in patterns of homage and castle guard that touched every household in degrees. Knights quartered below tightened girths and checked mail where lamplight fell in warm ovals, their horses shifting with the contented heaviness of animals familiar with the routine. The traveller, warmed by the hearth's steady breath, placed the satchel by the bed curtains and listened to the rhythm of the watch, the soft call at the gate and the answering tread on the walkway. A frontier in this sense was not a line but a fabric, and the envoy had come to feel its weave in the ordinary exchanges of a winter evening. Charters did their quiet work as the fire sank, laying out how rents would be paid in grain or coin, how millstones would turn for the lord and for the parish, and how a small market might gather beside a ford under the protection of a royal grant. Oram has recorded how such instruments, backed by new sheriffs and earls, gave shape to lordship without unmaking the older customs beneath, and the sensation of that layered order touched even the simplest acts. A servant lifting the ale jug with practiced care, a guard warming hands at a brazier before taking the wall. The traveller wrote a brief note on the wax tablet to mark the errand complete. Delivery confirmed, provisions for the road promised, hospitality received as custom dictated. Beyond the shutters, wind pressed and sighed, and water in the ditch lapped softly at the pallets that shored the bank. The bed curtains muted the hall, cloth heavy with a faint, clean scent of lye, and the hearth gave one low crack as if acknowledging the hour. In this mixture of vigilance and ease, the northern frontier held its own kind of stillness. Made of stone newly set and words newly written, and of routines that promise to repeat themselves with the morning bell. The approach to the stronghold began with a narrow causeway raised above waterlogged ground, a deliberate line drawn across peat-dark fields toward an ancient mound now capped in stone. The old earthwork rose in patient curves, its skin tufted with grass, while the new masonry above it answered in straight courses and squared corners, a geometry learned in other lands and set down here with measured care. Along the base, a broad ditch lay stubbornly wet, fed by nearby pools and runnels, so that the whole site gathered itself like an island, defensible by nature and by art. Scholars such as Geoffrey Stell and W. Douglas Simpson have noted how Norman builders adapted familiar forms to local soils and waters, marrying the speed of an earthen motte with the assertion of a stone curtain and an austere hall. A clerkly rider, entrusted with messages and accustomed to reading both men and buildings, saw how each part spoke its function: ditch, rampart, causeway, and the intent of the ashlar courses. The wind slipped across the open ground and along the flanks of the mound, combing reeds, bringing the damp scent of moss and meadow, and then died against the sheer of the walls. What had once been quick timber and palisade now seemed to lean into time, the new work grounding itself where the old had required constant tending. The gate passage declared the change most clearly, for it gathered caution and welcome into a single narrow throat. Doors banded with iron waited within the arched entry, their drawbar sockets cut deep, while slit windows on either side promised watching eyes and ready bows. Above, a chamber for the porter and guard allowed a view down into the passage. Even without elaborate devices, the layering of thresholds, doors, and angles promised control. The clerk dismounted where told, crossed from timber bridge to stone sill, and heard boots on flags instead of planks, a sound as spare as the place itself. Torches breathed resin in the drift of air, their smoke pooling where the ceiling rose to a low vault, leaving faint trails along pale stone that had not yet swallowed its first decade of soot. Beyond the inner door, the ground rose gently toward the heart of the enclosure, and the building along the mound's crown showed few openings, each one narrow and carefully placed. The measured compression of entry gave way to a sober order, where movement could be seen and guided, and where a household's work could be sheltered without swagger. The curtain wall bound the bailey in a ring of mass and restraint, its base thick with clay and rubble core faced by tight-laid blocks, and its crest marked by a parapet just high enough to shield a man at a walk. In places, the wall stepped to match the lie of the mound, a compromise that let the fabric sit on firm ground rather than chase symmetry for its own sake. Arrow-slits, long and vertical outside, gently widened within, pierced the masonry at intervals that answered fields of fire, not decoration, and the wall-walk ran behind them like a sober corridor open to the sky. A stair set into the thickness brought those on watch to the parapet to look outward across fields and low water, and then inward to the hall atop the mound, where the light through a few tight windows lay narrow on lime-washed stone. Richard Oram has written that under King David I, new lords and craftsmen came north with charters and obligations, and with them travelled the knowledge of such defensive masonry and the feudal household it enabled. The clerk moved with courtesy among men-at-arms whose speech ran south and north together, their service defined as much by written terms as by custom, their station reflected in the wall that kept the place and its stores. Against a sky that carried long winds, The ring of stone drew a clean line, not bristling but firm. The upper hall on the mound's crown kept to purpose, a long, high room with a scant scattering of carved detail, its authority resting in proportion more than ornament. A hearth set upon a central slab, murmured with peat and a little wood, the smoke rising toward a vent in the roof, then curling in soft skeins that darkened beams and joined the faint pitch of winter on the stones. Benches and trestles stood ready for meat, tall cups and talk, while nearer the fire a curtained bed offered a pocket of warmth to a favored guest, its hangings softened by soot and light. Bread still warm from the bakehouse crusted gently as it cooled, and the nutty smell of malted ale lifted through the room when a jug was opened, giving the air a low sweetness beneath the smoke. The traveler drew parchment from a leather case and placed it near the lamp, wax beads catching the flame, the seal impressed by another hand far to the south, now present in this plain, weighty space. Narrow windows cut as arrow-slits had shutters within, boards that could be swung closed against the wind's insistence or opened to let in a streak of grey day, and the play of their fittings gave the walls a kind of quiet speech. The sum of these provisions, bed linen warmed by the hearth, clean crust, sound drink, and stone that kept the draught from the bones, marked a new kind of comfort, born from discipline. Design and sight spoke together in a language of caution learned from marsh and mound, the builders working out how weight could be carried by the old earth without betrayal. The base of the hall spread wider than the walls above, its footings laid low and broad, and any cracks on the mound's flank had been bound with fresh turf and packed clay, tending the ground on which the masonry rested. Drainage gullies cut discreetly along the inner yard coaxed water away toward the ditch, so that clay would not swell and shift beneath the load, and this simple tending repaired what timber forts had never fully solved. A small turret of stairs rose squarely from the wall at one corner, its steps set tight and slightly irregular, guiding those inside to the parapet without stealing space from the hall, and a thin chute for a garderobe fell to the ditch where reeds made their simple peace with such burdens. In the wall's thickness, a few recesses kept lamps from draughts, and stored the necessities of a household that must be ready yet spare. Hooks for mail, pegs for cloaks, a second bowstring kept from damp. Simpson wrote of such works as both shelter and statement, their lines carrying a message about lordship as steady as the bonds that defined service, and the place here illustrated the point without ostentation. Under the weight of stone, the Motte and Bailey plan quieted into something slower and more enduring, a structure not merely raised upon the land, but settled into it. Evening gathered early, sanding edges and making the geometry gentler, as the watch took their rounds and the household turned inward from the causeway. The wind pressed and sighed at the shutters, a companionable sound in a room where the fire kept its color and the straw-stuffed mattress beside it grew warm behind its curtains. A boy came with a trencher piled with bread heels and a wedge of cheese, and the clerk ate with slow ease, washing the crust with ale, whose bitterness sat lightly on the tongue after a day of cold air. Beyond the hall, footsteps rang softly on the wall-walk, and voices drifted down in simple reports. The ditch held water, the fields lay empty, the sky showed no flame. Geoffrey Stell has observed that strength here was not only measured in height and thickness, but in such consistent habits of care, a pattern of watch and maintenance that allowed stone to do its work. In the lamplight, the ashlar courses read as a set of lines that had been ruled once and for all, while the reed beds and the peat beyond kept their own older measure, the two now held together by the curve of the mound. With bread finished, the bed curtains drawn and the shutters set against the night air, the new fortress did what it promised. It steadied the dark with order and allowed rest without forgetting the world beyond. Within the shelter of the curtain wall, the inner ward gathered its working life against stone and turf, with huts and lean-tos pressed close to the lee of the masonry. A timber stair, creaking under iron-shod feet, climbed the earthen mound to the hall above, while below, grooms led steaming horses toward a narrow stable bay, straw rustling underfoot. The forge glowed in its corner, a squat mouth of orange, where a smith drew a shoe from the coals and set it hissing to the wet, the sound soft and steady under the mutter of voices. Smoke from the kitchens drifted low along the wall walk, then rose in ragged scarves through a break in the cloud, carrying with it the sour, sweet hint of mash and the nutty promise of baking grain. Along the inside of the curtain, racks of spears and round shields stood under a stretched awning, their silhouettes neat and faintly wet from a day of damp air. Sergeants paced the wall-head with practiced quiet, pausing at the angle towers to peer out through embrasures and exchange murmured news with the next man along. Lanterns marked the gate and the base of the stair, 2 islands of honeylight in a yard where rushes and trampled clay kept a memory of rain. Kitchens and bakehouse sat shoulder to shoulder, their roofs low and darkened by years of breath from hearth and oven, their doors open to spill warmth into the passage between them and the wall. A long hearth of beaten clay held iron crocks and a trestle for spits, and a junior cook turned a wooden handle that lifted and lowered a pot over the coals, chasing a gentle simmer. Beside the oven's domed mouth, the baker brushed coarse flour from his sleeve and scored loaves with a quick, sure hand. The rind would split and darken, and the crumb within would be close and moist, suited to thick slices dipped in broth. Ale slept in togethered casks in the coolest bay, where stone and packed earth kept a steady temperature, and a bucket on a rope passed from tun to pitcher with the ease of long habit. Behind a half wall, a bench held cleavers and mallets, and hooks for hanging linen bags of herbs and salt, while a brazier prickled with embers to light spills and seal wax when needed. Scholars such as Geoffrey Stell and W. Douglas Simpson have noted that such service buildings commonly leaned into the curtain for shelter and convenience, a pattern that tied heat and smell and labor to the margin of the ward, while freeing the center for movement and muster. Not far from the gate a smithy clinked, and across from it a carpenter's bench lay scattered with curlings of fur, the smell of resin mingling with the tang of iron, a reminder that tools, fuel, and food traveled a disciplined loop within the walls. The upper hall crowned the earthen mound with a spare dignity, its lime-washed stone catching firelight and turning it pale and steady, like sunlight recalled. A central hearth burned on a shallow stone curb, its edges chalked with ash where shovels had passed, while a louvre in the roof gathered the smoke and set it wandering upward in grey streams that found their way through rafters and out into the night. Windows were narrow arrows of space cut through thick wall, each fitted with a timber shutter held by an iron hasp. When shut against the weather, they left a low whirring as air found the edges and sighed. Benches and trestles ran the length of the room, their boards planed plain and set so that the end nearest the dais could be cleared in a moment for council or supper, then reset for writing, tallying, or prayer. Chests with bands of hammered iron lined the walls, some holding salt and linen, others holding writs and charters, and a seal matrix wrapped in cloth. A small coffer with a triple hasp sat within reach of the steward's place, its lid burnished by years of careful hands. Guidance from Stell and Simpson on the purpose of such chambers helps frame the space. Not a palace so much as the durable heart of lordship, part dining room, part counting house, part courtroom, and part storeroom for obligations. To one side, a curtained bed stood near the hearth, a stout frame with rope lattice and a mattress of flock and straw, the textiles heavy with lanolin and smoke, ready to offer a learned envoy traveling under a noble's warrant the first easy rest in many miles. Ceremony softened into routine as the evening meal moved through its stages, and the hall became a careful pattern of footsteps, ladles, and low voices. Loaves were broken with reverence and passed down the benches, the crust crackling under a knife, and the crumbs soaking a ladle of pottage in which barley, onion, and a few shreds of beef had spent the day learning each other's company. A trencher carried salt fish with parsley and a hint of vinegar, while a platter of beef gave up steam and a firmness that yielded under a blade designed for the work. Beside it, a wheel of cheese sweated faintly and cut clean. The ale tasted of malt and mild smoke, and it moved from pitcher to cup with a practical grace, neither hurried nor ceremonious, watched over by a steward who kept count of measures as readily as he weighed the day's tallies. Near the dais, the traveler noted the quiet of efficient service. The boy who waited with a cloth to wipe a trestle, the kitchen woman who slipped in and out with ewers, the sergeant who took a small place near the door and kept his eyes on the hinge. With shutters fastened against a restless wind, sound fell to a steady hush broken by low speech and the occasional creak of a bench, and the smell of the hearth grew round and restful, the smoke lifting and thinning as ash deepened. When the last trencher had been cleared, the trestles closest to the fire were eased aside to make room for the bed curtains to be drawn, the traveling clerk's satchel placed within reach, his wax tablets on a chest where embers cast a gentle glow. The castle's pulse ran on past supper with the practiced rhythms of a small garrison. A watch changed at the gate, a handbell murmured the hour, and the great bar slipped into its sockets with a contained thud that travelled through the timbers of the door. Grooms bedded the horses, and checked girths hung to dry, the familiar chorusing noises of a stable muffled by straw and the thick wall, while a dog stationed itself near the threshold as if drawn by duty rather than command. A sergeant took a turn along the stair of the mound, counting steps by habit, and paused to test the laces of a shutter on the windward side. The slit admitted a thread of air that hummed and fell away like distant surf. In the hall, the traveller rested at last under linens that smelled of smoke and wool, while the hearth settled into a red eye of coals, the occasional pop sending up a slow drift of sparks that went nowhere and dimmed. Sleep drew near in measured increments, a murmur from the ward, the clink of a chain at the postern, the soft sluice of water poured to quench the last fire in the kitchen, and the faintest rustle along the rafters. What might appear austere by later standards had the shape of order and shelter in this time and place, each object earning its corner, ladle, bench, chest, and trestle. each person moving along routes learned by repetition. Somewhere beyond the wall, lowland reeds shifted under a breeze, and somewhere within the wall, tally sticks and seals waited to be taken up again by morning light. Contexts given by historians add a larger frame to the quiet of such a night, easing the mind with explanation that matches what the senses have reported. Richard Oram has written of a reign that drew northern reaches into new patterns of authority, where tenants held by service and charters carried obligations, and halls such as this one functioned as both hostelry and instrument for keeping faith with those structures. Stonework, in this sense, signaled more than permanence. It advertised a ledger's logic in a land where timber had until recently served for meeting and defense, and the earthen mound under the hall stated an intention to see and be seen. Walls were thick to carry the weight of roof and season, but also thick to hide passages for latrines and small stairs, so that the business of living could proceed even when weather pressed. Mortar and rubble worked with the earth beneath, and timber walked the line between convenience and risk in hearth and stair. The masonry never forgot its partnership with wood and turf. Shingles creaked, doors swelled and shrank, and rushes were renewed with each turn of the moon, keeping pests at bay and scenting the hall faintly with meadow. In the balance described by Stell and Simpson, the pragmatic spread of workshops and the measured dignity of the upper chamber, lay the habit of governance, a dependable arrangement of spaces that made order possible without demanding luxury. Under that arrangement, the traveller's curtained bed, the good bread and ale, and the wind's mild song beyond shuttered apertures became not extravagance, but steady tokens of a life kept in guard and good repair. Warmth settled first around the hearthstone in the upper hall, where ash and ember made a low red country of light across the flagging. A loaf with a hard singed crust was set out beside a knife, its interior pale and tight-crumbed, and a wooden cup of ale cooled slowly as the fire breathed. Smoke drifted in muted skeins beneath the rafters, for the Louvre shutter was drawn against the weather, and the sting of it lingered in the traveller's eyes without pressing them to tears. A bed with curtained woolen hangings had been pulled nearer to the blaze, the fabric catching and releasing the firelight in soft folds, while a sheepskin cast dulled the chill that seeped through stone. Beyond, narrow arrow-slits stood latched with boards, and through their seams a thread of air carried the long, even sigh of wind running across the mound and over the wet ground below. Knots in the great timbers answered that weather with a quiet, patient creak, as if the hall itself kept a measured breath to match the watch at the gates. Practical hospitality framed the meal, and its plainness suited a posting where permanence was newly claimed. The bread broke cleanly with a rough snap, leaving crumbs to dust a palm and the board, while the ale held a steady, cereal sweetness with a hint of bitter greens. A servant ladled out a simple pottage heavy with barley and a few shreds of salted meat, and the smell of onions softened by heat threaded through the room. Neither spice nor show colored the service, yet each small provision arrived with an air of intention, set down where it would carry the most warmth and least waste. Those who had come north with the Lord's household kept their voices low, conserving breath and privacy in the same motion that rationed fuel through a long season. The envoy ate slowly to keep company with the fire, taking note as much of the cadence of the place as of the fare itself. Work resumed when the bowl was cleared, and the traveller drew a rushlight close, its faint hiss and pear-shaped flame giving just enough clarity to the parchment. A folded draft of a charter lay ready for clean copying, where the measured Latin that Richard Orham links with the king's reorganized realm set out gifts of land and service with careful equilibrium. Names of tenants were rehearsed under the breath and checked against memory. Men set to hold ploughgates by night service, men to answer for mulchers and fords, men to back a bridge at harvest time, and seals were weighed for order on a thong. The wax, warmed between fingers then fused with a brass stamp, took impressions cleanly in the mild air near the hearth, each crest a small sharp island rising from the cooled red. Quill and knife worked together, trimming and mending, while sand picked up stray ink and the scratch of letters kept time with the crackle from the logs. Across this task spread a consciousness of distance and linkage, of how the crown's language carried South Country forms into a province where older customs still held sway, and of how binding words held that meeting like a clasp. Architecture did a kindred kind of work, binding a landscape to a new rule through stone and earth. The fortress stood on an earthen mound thrown up above marshy ground, its sides scarped into a steep cone where the keep rose, and below that the enclosing curtain wall traced a hard line that caught moonlight. Scholars such as Geoffrey Stell have described the way such mottes and masonry travelled with lordships, making a visible grammar of power that spoke quickly where speech might falter. W. Douglas Simpson wrote of their austere economy, few refinements, strong lines, living quarters that balanced shelter with defence, and this upper hall answered those notes with a plain table, a serviceable hearth, and narrow windows set not for scene but for protection. Timber galleries and stairs clicked underfoot like tightened bowstrings, and ironwork on doors gripped its hinges with purpose, giving every movement a restrained echo. Even the furnishings acknowledged the site's edge of realm intention, benches that stacked away for musters, chests that could be roped and lowered, and the bed itself arranged so that warmth and readiness were never far apart. Sounds of vigilance threaded the evening without sharpness, a muted fabric of care. From the stair beyond the screen's passage came the soft, regular tread of a guard changing post, accompanied by the faint touch of mail rings against leather. On the ward below, a horse stamped once in its stall and settled, the rustle of straw a whisper where stone met earth. The portcullis chain ticked lightly in a gust, then fell still again, and someone stifled a cough rather than let it climb into the rafters. Voices reached no higher than the third board on the wall, and the shared understanding of distance made conversation slow, even dignified, as if space itself asked for a measured tone. In that restraint, ordinary life persisted, an older man coaxing a coal to flame in a side brazier, a girl with a tub returning with water, the cook counting dried peas by handfuls into a sack, each small motion a pledge that the place would hold through darkness and weather. The traveller's parchment gathered a few stray flecks of ash as the rushlight shortened, and thoughts wandered briefly to the route that had led to this table. Southward lay burghs and priories tied into the king's programme, places where the new tenurial order had found easy footing. Northward lay districts only recently settled to that mesh, their local lines redrawn, their earlier halls giving way to towers. Orham's account of reform often dwells on the administrative web, sheriffs, burgh customs, royal pleas, and that web could be felt here, tangible as the parchment, but carried by messengers through rain and thaw. The envoy's notes for the morning included a meeting with a knight of immigrant stock married into a local kin group, a practical example of how families braided custom with charter without loosening either strand. There were also tallies of oats owed for garrison feed, a query about a ferry whose rope had parted in flood, and a margin mark to remind the lord that one tenant's service might be better commuted to silver while fields lay sodden. Work of this kind turned the hall into a counting room as much as a shelter, and the rhythm of it, unhurried but continuous, promised steadiness across the long months. In the pause after a paragraph's completion, comfort returned to the fore, steady and unassuming. The traveller drew the bed curtains partway against the draught, leaving a breathing space toward the hearth, and the mattress of straw and fleece adapted to wait with a sigh. A cloak warmed by the fire gave off a clean, oily scent where the lanolin had not been entirely washed from the wool, and the linen undershift carried a hint of wood smoke that would never quite leave it. The ale was finished in 2 small swallows, not enough to cloud the head, enough to draw the last edge of cold out of fingers and throat. Sleep did not come at once, for habit placed attention on footsteps, on the low conference at the screens, on the tiny rattle of a shutter as a squall passed. Yet none of those sounds stirred alarm. In their sifting and settling, the patterns of the place asserted themselves, and rest grew from that knowledge like a hearth built of coals rather than flame. Weather pressed harder against the hall in the second part of the night, and the structure's responses kept calm company with anyone wakeful at a desk or on a pallet. The curtain wall took the force first, turning wind into a sound like guarded surf, while the mound below shed water into ditches designed for such work. Stell's observation that stone and earth here were as much about endurance as display seemed borne out in every groan that ended in stillness. A lantern moved briefly along the wall walk and vanished behind the angle of a turret, leaving only the sense of a presence where cold might otherwise take liberty. The envoy's last thought before closing the inkhorn was of a seal impression cooling firm, and of a parchment rolled and tied so that decisions taken in this quiet would travel miles and weeks toward their effect. In that union of warmth and watchfulness, the hall kept faith with its purpose, holding people, papers, and provisions in one measured shelter while the wild pressed its palm to the stones and then withdrew. First light slid across rough masonry and turf, drawing out the plain geometry of a towered hall on its earthen mound, and the ring of a low, stout curtain below. Mist uncoiled from the wet ditches and from the cropped pastures beyond, softening palisade shadows and catching on the tips of rushes where water lay in shallow pools. A bar lifted from its sockets with a softened thump, and the hinge of the outer doors answered the morning with a slow, oiled breath. Within, the cobbles kept the echo to themselves. From the upper chamber came the fading smell of last night's peat and ash, bread crust warming again by the embers, and the faint spice of ale pitched in a clay jug set near the hearthstone. The narrow slits of the hall, shuttered against the wind through the dark hours, opened by degrees, letting in a ribbon of pale sky and the small speech of rooks along the fields. On the slope of the Motte, damp timbers of the stair gave off their own smell, and a sentry's cloak steamed gently where he paused, watching the low ground where cattle and men would begin to move. The traveller rose from behind the woolen curtains of a bed set sensibly near the fire. gathered vellum and seal purse with the accustomed care of a clerk, and listened to the measured stirrings of a place that answered the day with unadorned resolve. Morning reflection gathered around the stone itself, for the new language of power lay in its courses and joints as clearly as in any spoken oath. Writers on fortifications have traced such places northward in this century, noting how timber rings and halls gave way to rubble-built walls, gatehouses with shooting slits, and high rooms where lordship could sit and be seen. Geoffrey Stell, in Scottish Castles and Fortifications, set that sequence beside the changing needs of rule. W. Douglas Simpson, writing earlier on the ancient castles of the realm, described the way an earthen mound might be crowned first by wood and later by masonry, the earthwork remaining as a durable stage for each generation's improvements. Richard Oram, considering the reign of David I, followed the movement of tenure and office alongside these stones, mapping the spread of sheriffs, burghs, and reformed monasteries that tethered authority to land and to law. In this district, settlement by families from the Low Countries and from the Anglo-Norman world had been encouraged by grants and royal favour, and new parishes and estates had been drawn across the old patterns of kindred and pasture. A Cistercian house not far to the east would soon raise its choir and fields within sight of the shore, part of a tide of ecclesiastical patronage that softened the import of rule and ordered it to liturgical time. The traveller's notes held these names and currents in neat lines of Latin, but the stones around spoke the same argument in another medium: permanence, custody, and the measured division of space. Work resumed in the ward with a confidence that did not hurry, for routine had learned the weather here and kept to tasks that fit the light. Grain bins in a low storehouse received inspection, their lids lifted to show barley, oats, and a seasoned store of rye. Salted fish in casks carried the tang of shore winds, and a cooper's hammer answered from the shade where hoops were tightened. At the bakehouse, loaves slid from the oven face with a dull gloss and a clean crust, and the buttery accounted for ale by the jug under the steward's tally. This was not luxury but steadiness, proof against lean weeks and travelling men. Men-at-arms changed watches at the gate, exchanging brief words where spearheads ticked against the shield rack, and a saddler in the lean-to checked girths for a day's ride that might only circle the grazing and the outer farms. In the hall, rushes had been drawn into new lines, a bench added to the fire's reach, and on the table lay a sheaf of charters awaiting confirmation, their tags cut from good vellum and made ready for the stamp of wax. The traveller unrolled a letter with a seal from a neighbouring lord, who held his land by knight service, prepared to witness the transfer of a small strip of meadow that completed a demesne field. Oaths here were quiet, practical, and confined to what boundary stones and ditches could remember. The record of it would travel to a chest by the Lord's bed and perhaps later to a church's archive, where scripts of the same hand, curled, balanced, and spare, kept the memory of land as surely as any wall. The fortress stood in conversation with its setting, mediating between ploughland and the upland reaches that lay behind the first lines of hill. On the lower ground, strips of infield gleamed with dew, their ridges drawn long and regular, and beyond them, rough pasture broke toward heath, where summer sheelings would take cattle farther off when the weather lifted. Gaelic speech, with its steady music, met the clipped syllables of French in the yard, and both yielded in the hall to Latin when ink and law were at hand. The place held these tongues without strain, as a good wall holds both wind and warmth. A reeve paced with a measuring rod along a barn threshold, setting out rents in kind and noting small remissions where fences had failed in a storm. Such acts were part of a governance that prized account, promise, and return. The bed near the hearth, the cupboard with its cups of horn and wood, and the clean bowl of porridge set for a messenger made a modest comfort that did not forget the need for watchmen on the wall. As scholars have remarked, the change came less as a single blow than as a patient graft. Stones, customs, and liturgies set in new rows until fields, parishes, and lordships showed the same pattern from river mouth to moor. With the gates unbarred, the day simply unfolded. Hooves rang on the causeway, smoke trailed in a thin blue from the louver, and the traveller stepped into a light that promised work, bread, and a steady hand on the edge of wide country. Night gathers in quiet layers, and the fortress grows smaller within its own stones. Beyond the earthen motte and folded curtain wall, the fields and water meadows fall into a dusk so broad that it seems to cradle the whole horizon. Within, the upper hall breathes its slow heat, a patient heart inside ashlar ribs. The hearth settles, the lamp flame thins, shadows nestle into the joinery like tame birds at roost. In this hour, the traveller senses how masonry teaches a lesson in duration. Timber had creaked and sighed under storms, but stone asks for patience and gives it back in kind. As scholars have noted, Geoffrey Stell on the quiet logic of walls, W. Douglas Simpson on the hard school of northern winds, such places were never only calendars of power. They became calendars of weather, of labor, of small comforts rehearsed each night until they felt like custom. A curtain drawn across a bed, bread broken along a familiar seam, ale as mellow as the hush before sleep. The wind passes the arrow-slits with a voice that is almost speech. Shutters hold the draught at a respectful distance, and the flame nods. On the bench, a bundle of writings lies gathered with a strap. Testimony to journeys counted in chapel bells and fords, in formal greetings and careful wax. Under a cloak's fold, the spine softens against wool and warmth. The stones are cool where the air can touch them, but the floor yields a memory of embers, and comfort lifts like steam from a morning bakehouse. Somewhere below, a watchman turns on the wall walk. The rhythm of his steps recognizes the ground in a way that maps cannot. Richard Oram has written of a rain that knit new threads through old cloth, and that fabric can be heard here in the measured tread, the hush of the hall, the tempered voice of the wind. Feudal forms and Norman ashlar, sewn into a northern dusk, but in the seam runs a steady pulse, stewardship, habit, the slow, deliberate making of a place. Nothing presses at the threshold now. The hall keeps its own counsel, and the land accepts the weight of sleep. The traveller leans into the softness promised by linen and fur, a small island of rest moored to a great, patient masonry. Heat gentles the air. The last spark loosens from the log and disappears without drama. Stone, wind, and wool draw close. Bread and ale turn to quiet strength. The night closes like a book with a ribbon laid between its pages, and the page that waits is safe and still and ready for morning.